It's with great pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker, Professor Rajesh Rao. And he comes from our very own University of Washington Department of Computer Science and Engineering. Now, his research spans the areas of computational neuroscience, brain-computer interfaces, and robotics. Now, he's interested in how the brain makes decisions, despite the incredibly complex sensory environment that we always find ourselves within. And he's also interested in understanding how brain signals can be used for controlling computer interfaces and robots and our actions. Professor Rao received his PhD from the University of Rochester, and he was a Sloan postdoctoral fellow at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in San Diego before arriving here at the University of Washington. Now, his significant contributions to his research field was recognized very early on in his career, as he is the recipient of the National Science Foundation Career Award, the Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award. He was a Fulbright Scholar, he was a Sloan Fellow, as well as a David and Lucille Packard Fellow for Science and Engineering, amongst other accomplishments. He is the author of new textbooks called Brain-Computer Interfacing, and he's also co-edited and wrote a couple of books on statistical analyses of the brain that are really quite exciting. So currently, Professor Rao is director of the NSF Center for the Sensorimotor Neural Engineering here at the University of Washington. Again, it's a great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Rao.
So thank you, Sherry, and thank you all for your patience, and thank you for spending the evening with us. What I'll talk about today is it's a transition from what David talked about so beautifully about how the brain makes decisions. I'd like to begin by transitioning from decision. So once you made a decision, how do you put that into action, right? So just think about a simple kind of action, for example, reaching up to pick up a cup of water, right? So just think about what that involves. Can we really understand how the brain puts together the different commands it needs to send to the muscles that will eventually end up you picking up the cup of water, right? So neuroscientists have tried to study this particular aspect. So you made a decision, you're now moving, about to pick something up. How do we actually study that particular aspect of brain function, right? So this is a classical result that I'll talk about that goes back, a couple of decades, and this is trying to understand how the motor cortex, which is one of the fundamental areas in the brain that's about, at the top of your head there, as shown in that diagram. It sends commands to the muscles through the spinal cord, and then it has to come up with a way of putting together those commands, right? So one example of a task that people have studied is this classic task called center-out task. So you're an animal or a human is moving their hand in different directions, so in this case, 8 different directions. So now you can study what kind of responses are you getting from neurons, brain cells that are in that particular area. So as David mentioned, there's electrodes that you can use, little wires that you can put in the brain and start to study what exactly are these neurons doing when the animal, in this case a monkey, is making a movement towards a particular location on a table, for example. And so if you zoom in, perhaps you have a population of these cells. And it turns out that every cell that you record from in this particular task, it'll prefer one particular direction. So let's say neuron number 1 prefers, it responds the most when you move your hand in a particular direction. There's another neuron that might respond the most when you move your hand in the opposite direction, another one that moves when you move in between those 2 directions, and so on. So you have a population of cells, and they're each coding for one particular direction of motion. So this is a very fundamental result that people found when they were looking at these cells as part of their neuroscience research. And so here's one implication of that, which is this was a pretty astounding implication in the sense that you could now reconstruct or predict the movement of the animal's arm by just summing together the activities in terms of the directions that each of those cells are preferring. So at the very bottom there, you can see these black lines. So each line is drawn in proportion to how active that particular cell is. And there's about 30 or 40 of these cells that you've recorded from. And just based on the activity, how active a particular cell is, I can mathematically then compute a direction. The red arrow there is a direction of movement that you're predicting from brain activity. Right? So that's a very classical result going back to the 1980s from Georgopoulos' lab. And since I'm a professor, I'd like to sort of begin with lessons, right? So here's one of the first lessons that we have for this talk. And there will be a final exam at the end. So try to remember these lessons, right? So here's the first lesson, which is that, based on the activities of cells in your motor cortex, we can predict the direction of movement, right? And in general, you can predict other aspects of movement also, such as the velocity of movement and so on, right? So you might ask, this is something that scientists asked, a decade or so ago, which was, hey, we could do this kind of prediction. We can predict what the movement is going to be. Could this be useful for an application, right? So just spend a couple of seconds thinking about, okay, what could we use this for, right? If you are a scientist and you said, okay, in my lab, I can figure out, which direction the arm of this person or monkey is moving towards, could that be useful for another person, right, who might be able to use this fact, and then we could help that person, right? So this is something that Andy Schwartz, one of the co-authors of that paper, actually did, and so I'll give you the result here. So this was a person who's paralyzed, and Andy and his team were able to take these signals from the motor cortex of this person, and the person was able to use that activity in their brain to control a robotic arm. So for the very first time here, she's eating her favorite chocolate, right? Feeding herself. And this was a very remarkable result, right? So this is a very remarkable result. This goes back to a few years ago. And this took a little bit of training. It wasn't instantaneous, but the patient was able to come in. She was able to use the computer and the robotic arm that was in the lab at Pittsburgh. And she was able to train over a period of several weeks to control this pretty complicated device. And you can now start to see this promise of bridging neuroscience and engineering. It's an area called neural engineering, where you're starting to use results from neuroscience, results like the ones that David talked about, and starting to apply that to build devices that can be used to help people who might be paralyzed or otherwise neurologically disabled. So this device is an example of something called a brain-computer interface. You might also hear the word brain-machine interface. And these are devices that interface, as the word implies, with the brain or other parts of the nervous system. And they serve a purpose, right? They help people who might otherwise not be able to perform certain functions. So you might ask, where have you seen such devices before, right? So in fact, you've seen a lot of these devices, maybe not in the context of a lab, right? So this is actually from, as you might have guessed it, Hollywood, right? So Hollywood's really been fascinated with these kinds of devices. This is an excerpt from a movie called Avatar, which many of you have probably seen. In this case, the idea here is that the person who's paralyzed is able to now control a body that's, I guess, in a different planet, right? And that's actually, the body of this creature is being animated by the thoughts of one particular person, right? And that's the reason for calling it Avatar, right? So this is basically a blockbuster movie and so on, right? So this was Hollywood's take on this kind of a device, and in fact goes back even to the Matrix, right? So you've probably seen this movie where the human brain is actually living in a simulated world, and it's kind of like the virtual reality that David talked about, except that now you're actually completely immersed, where the laws of physics can be completely changed, and the brain might not even know anything, right? It's like a brain in a vat, right? So the brain is actually believing in this artificial reality that you've created for it. And you can have things like you could fly in this artificial world. You could actually dodge bullets and things like that. And then other examples include, this is back in the 1980s with Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood was able to control, in this case, a fighter airplane's weapons, right? Using this was actually a Russian fighter airplane that he was trying to get for the US, right? So this was back in the 1980s, very beginnings of this mind-controlled devices. More recently, there's this Total Recall, where you can implant memories into a person so that they feel like they're actually have had an amazing vacation, even though they've actually just been sitting in that chair. You have memories of a pleasant vacation, right? And then, of course, there's Dr. Octopus from Spider-Man, controlling multiple limbs, so you have augmentation of your arms. And finally, also implanting ideas, right? So this is Inception, that you have this idea, interesting plot based on implanting ideas. So this makes for really good science fiction, right? So, but then, why would you really want to build such devices? So I already gave you that motivation of, a person who's paralyzed who might be able to control a prosthetic limb. So you might have heard of ALS. This is a disease. It's a progressive motor neuronal disease where the person loses control of their muscles. So this is, as you might have guessed, Stephen Hawking, who's probably the most famous person alive who has this particular condition. And so over time, his ability to control his body has decreased so that eventually he can only control, for example, little muscles on his cheek. And he uses that to write books, which is pretty amazing. And then eventually, if he loses control of even his muscles on his face, the only way for him to communicate would be to use his brain signals, right? So he's still able to generate the intention to move and so on, and hopefully you could decode that signal and can control a cursor, for example, on a computer screen, and that could allow him to communicate. Similarly, if he had a traumatic injury, so for example, this is Christopher Reeve, who had a traumatic injury when he fell off of a horse. Again, if you have a spinal cord injury, can we use these types of devices to reconnect the brain to the spinal cord so that they can reanimate their body, right? So that they can start moving again, they can start walking again, and so on. Other kinds of neurological conditions that we could hope to treat with these types of devices include Parkinson's disease, essential tremor, and even traumatic brain injury, some neurological conditions that could benefit from being able to parse the brain's activity and use it to either control another object or to stimulate another part of the brain to encourage rehabilitation. And finally, also, there's related work in terms of sensation restoration, right? So if you're blind or deaf, perhaps you could use some of these devices to enhance your ability to hear or to see. So just a couple of examples. You might have already heard of cochlear implants. So this is a device that's already FDA approved, and it has been implanted in several hundreds of thousands of children and adults. And this is, again, an example where you take a device where you have a microphone that takes audio, takes sound, and then parses it into a language that the brain can understand, and then electrically stimulates the auditory nerve, right, the cochlear nerve, so that the brain can now again start receiving some signals that it can then learn to parse and then learn to hear. Another example is something called a deep brain stimulator. This is a brain pacemaker, essentially, and it is sending some current pulses into a deep part of the brain, and this turns out to be very, very beneficial to people who have tremors, right, or other symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So people have had this device, and then when you turn it on, you can see a very dramatic difference between when the device is turned on and turned off, and where they're able to substantially improve their quality of life by having this device implanted. And both of these devices are FDA approved. They're available, and they're being implanted. So ultimately, I think if you look at the broader context, so what does this really mean in terms of devices such as what we've just talked about? These devices can be bidirectional, which is they can both record and stimulate the brain or another part of the nervous system, right? And so here's just a diagram to have in mind in terms of what is really involved if, as an engineer working with neuroscientists and neurosurgeons, you're trying to build these types of devices, right? So you have components where, first of all, you need to be able to record these signals. So that's the first part, signal acquisition. And then you have to be able to extract some interesting aspects of those signals, such as the activity of the direction of preference of those neurons that we talked about early on. And then once you've extracted these interesting, important features, then you can then make sense of them by using what in computer science is called machine learning, or if you want to go into it, you can classify those signals as one kind of signal or the other, right? So you can get meaningful information out, such as the direction of motion of the movement. And then you can send a control signal to the application, right? So different kinds of applications have been studied. So for example, moving a cursor on a computer screen is a device for communication for people who are completely logged in. That could be really useful to essentially replace a mouse by just using signals from the brain. And then also, if you're paralyzed, perhaps you can stimulate the muscles or the spinal cord to reanimate a paralyzed person's hand, right? So that's another application that we're working on. And then finally, also maybe some mobility solutions where you could maybe control a wheelchair or a prosthetic or an exoskeleton that can then enable you to walk again. And finally, the last part of these kinds of systems is to send information back to the brain, so you can get some feedback, so you can look at what's happening. For example, if you're trying to control a robotic hand, you can look at what's happening in the world, but a much more important kind of feedback is the sense of touch, right? So in order to really get a good sense of touch and the pressure and so on, the tactile sensation, you need to be able to send the information back to the brain, and that's done through stimulation. So stimulating the somatosensory part of the brain that can then learn to understand these sort of strange signals that are coming into the brain directly through stimulation. So let me just go through some examples, including work that's being done here at the University of Washington, and just to give you an idea of what we are able to do so far, right, in this particular field. And so in order to do that, let's begin by looking at different ways of extracting signals from the brain. So going from the most invasive to the least invasive ways of extracting signals from the brain. And so the least invasive way is, you could wear a swim cap with little holes on it, and you could have some gel in each of those holes, and you could put a wire with a little amplifier next to it, and then you could use that to record what are called EEG signals. So this is something that people have used for a long time for analyzing sleep. For example, if you have sleep disorders, you can go into the hospital and people strap you with this kind of a cap. And it records, as you can imagine, very noisy signals because you're very far away from the source of the signals, right? It's like going to the Husky Stadium, and you can be saying things to your neighbor, but if I'm above on a helicopter, I can't really hear what you're saying, right? Or if I'm outside in the parking lot, I can only tell if there's been a touchdown or not because everybody screams in unison, right? So that's the kind of signal you'll get if you're sitting on top of the head. If you're on the scalp and trying to listen into the brain, it's going to be a very noisy, very distant type of signal. A little bit closer to the brain is ECOG, which is what David talked about. And these are, again, in patients who are coming in for brain surgery for epilepsy. And so you have now these wires, these electrodes that are placed on the surface of the brain. So you're a little bit closer to the brain, but again, you're not listening to individual brain cells or individual neurons. And then finally, there's electrodes, which are these, you can think of them as really sharp, wires that are now embedded inside the brain. They penetrate the brain, and so they're close to brain cells, and they can listen in on the activity of the nearby brain cells. And so you can pick one of them out, the loudest one you're listening to, and then you can say, okay, I'm listening to one brain cell now. So each one of those 100 of these spikes might record one of them. So hopefully you'll get 50 to 60, right, based on where you put maybe simultaneously recording about 50 to 60 of these neurons, right? So as you can see, there's this spectrum of ways of recording. And similarly, you can use these recording modalities to also send electricity into the brain, so that's stimulating the brain, right? So you can send messages into the brain by stimulating the brain. And that's, again, done using similar kinds of 3 different levels of invasiveness. So let's look at some work that we're doing here in the case of electrodes that are inside the brain. So one of the things that we're doing at the center, so this is the hard-to-pronounce center, Sensorimotor Neural Engineering, so Center for Sensorimotor Neural Engineering. But what we do here is actually engineer devices that can help people who might have spinal cord injury or stroke or other kinds of neurological conditions. So one of the applications we're working on is something called a brain controlled spinal interface. So this is for a person who might have had spinal cord injury. So in this case, the idea is to record from the brain, extract the intention to move, and then send that signal by bypassing the area of injury, send that signal directly to the spinal cord, the segment that's controlling, let's say, the hand, right? So as you can imagine, it's a very challenging problem. But if it works, then that could be a monumental change in the quality of life of the person who might have had spinal cord injury and is unable to utilize their body, right? So they have the intention to move, but the signal is no longer getting through due to the injury. And so there's some work being done by Chet Morris, who's the deputy director of the center, building on some work that had been done early on when he was a postdoc with Ev Fetz, who's a leader in the field, also a part of our center. A related project is, again, using the same idea of recording and stimulating for stroke rehabilitation. So if a person has stroke in a particular location in the brain, there's, again, a disconnection between one brain area and another brain area. So this project aims to co-activate locations in the brain that are neighboring the area of stroke so that you can eventually build natural connections. So this is actually an example of targeted neural rehabilitation, right? So right now, most of the ways of handling stroke is through therapy. You go through physical therapy, and you hope that the brain has found a way to rewire itself so that you regain movement. This particular device, which has now been shown in animal models to increase the connections between brain areas, this can be, again, used for stroke rehabilitation. So this is an example of, again, a bidirectional brain-computer interface. So let me go to some examples that we have worked on, which involves ECOG, which is the same kind of signal that David talked about. And again, just to remind you, these are being done in patients at Harborview Hospital who are there mainly for being monitored for seizures, right? So this is actually a very young patient who was working with my graduate student, Kai Miller. And so we basically go in there, we ask them, are you able to do some scientific experiments? And this is when they're being monitored for up to 10 days in the hospital. And the surgeon and the clinicians are looking for the source of seizures in the brain, and that's why they are being monitored in the hospital. But during that time, they have the array, they have up to several tens of electrodes that are scattered on the surface of the brain. And so we're now able to record from the brain. We can ask them to do these experiments, and if they're willing and interested in doing them, they will say yes. And so here's just an example of what this looks like, right? So you can see at the top there's an actual picture of a patient's brain with the electrodes on top of it. And in this case, it's about 64 electrodes. It's a grid of 8 by 8 electrodes. And the main point here is that each of these locations, each of these electrodes is recording from several 100,000, up to 1 million neurons, right? So it's not really a very precise indicator it doesn't give you a very precise activity, but it gives you the aggregated activity, right, of several hundreds and thousands of neurons. So what does this really look like? So here's another lesson, right, which is that movement, right, influences the activity you record, right? So here's the difference between when you're resting and when you ask the patient to move their hand, right? So you rest, you get the activity that's shown in the green. So you can see there's some slow fluctuations in the signal. And then when you ask them to move their hand, you start to see a disappearance of that slow fluctuation and now an increase in the rapid fluctuations, very, very fast oscillations in the signal. And that's a very characteristic signature you see across all patients and that we've seen. And here's just a map of that on the brain, right? So the red spot there shows you where you have a very high activity in terms of the rapid fluctuations. And then the blue over there shows you, if you look at the slow fluctuations, blue means that the slow fluctations have gone down, they've disappeared, whereas the red means there's been an increase in the rapid fluctuations. So there's this nice dichotomy in terms of what's really happening in the brain. And so we're able to figure out, okay, what is their intention right now? Is it to move or is it to rest in this case? And so, and finally, you might also ask, okay, what if somebody's paralyzed, they obviously cannot move their hand, but what if they form the intention to move? So what about motor imagery? So instead of you moving your hand, if you just imagine moving your hand, does that activate the same region of your brain? And the answer is yes, it does. It does activate the same neurons in your brain, the same set of neurons, but there's a difference between actually activating it to move your hand versus activating it when you're imagining moving your hand. And you can see that here for one particular patient. And the numbers are just give you some relative activation levels for imagining versus actually moving, right? So interestingly, now, so suppose you take that signal that is generated when you're imagining moving your hand, and you couple it to the movement of a cursor. So you say, okay, every time you imagine moving your hand, I'm going to move a cursor on a computer screen to go up, to hit a target, right? And then whenever you relax, I'm going to make the cursor go down because it gives you a different signal. Now you have a very simple brain-computer interface for communication, right? You can use that signal for a simple yes or no answer, or to, you can make it a selection, right, mechanism for somebody who's completely logged in. And interestingly, when you use that for this brain-computer interface, what you find is something different, which is, so I already told you that there's a decrease in the activity when you're imagining the movement. But what happens if you couple it to the cursor, right? So just to give you an idea of what this means, this is just a graph to show you what happens when you move versus rest. So the red one is plotting the power for the electrical engineers among you in terms of frequency. And so you can see there's a difference, right? The take-home message here is there's a difference between when you move versus when you imagine moving versus when you are resting. And you can couple that difference in power to the velocity of the cursor. So whenever you have an activation that's more than what you typically get on average, then you make the cursor go up. And whenever the power is below the average, you make the cursor go down. So it's a simple control mapping, right, from the brain activity to the movement of a cursor, okay? So we ask the patient to now control this cursor to hit the target. So we put the target either at the top or the bottom, and they just have to activate their brain activity in a particular location in the brain, and then that would move the cursor up or down, okay? And so here's what we get after training. So this is after several trials. So this is within about 20 to a 30-minute period, where they learn and they start to learn to control the cursor. And this is the end result, which is, in this case, the patient was imagining saying a word. So again, it's a motor movement. You're moving the mouth, but they're imagining seeing the word move every time they want the cursor to go up. And what you'll notice is that there's something called the Broca's area that is controlling movement it's implicated in speech. And so every time they activate that particular area, it shows up as a red. And that, in turn, causes the cursor to go up. And if they want the cursor to go down, they have to relax. And so you see a lot of blue on that brain pattern. And so that's how they've learned to control this particular cursor. And so the interesting question to ask is, OK, what is really happening in their brain as they're learning to control this very artificial device, right? They're not controlling their own body. They're controlling this thing that's out there, right? And you'll find that as they learn to control the cursor, you can see at the very top the accuracy going higher. So they're getting better and better at hitting the targets. You'll see an amplification of activity in that particular location in the brain that is being used to control the cursor. And in fact, what you'll find is that if you look at the red activation locations there, what we found is that they're able to increase the activity even beyond the activity that you expect when they're actually moving their own hand, right? So they've actually gone even beyond the activity that they normally use to move their hand, right? Or in this case, say the word move. It's actually gone to the point where they've amplified it to even beyond what you normally need to move your hand. So that just shows you the kind of potential there is in terms of the flexibility that the brain has to really activate its networks of neurons to accomplish a task, in this case, controlling a cursor. All right, so what about going all the way to non-invasive, right? So it's not very often that you have brain surgery, right? So it's something that is only as a last resort. So what if you can record signals from the surface of the brain, from the scalp, and use that to control devices, right? So here's the third lesson, which is EEG is noisy, as I mentioned, but it is correlated with brain activity. So you can get some interesting things out of it. So here's an example of what is called a beta wave, right? So slow, like a 14 to 18 hertz, 14 to 18 hertz oscillation, right? So, and this is typically associated with alertness, right? So when you walked into this auditorium, maybe you're alert and you're really paying a lot of attention throughout David's talk, and so this is the kind of pattern that you probably had, right, in your brains. And then over time, maybe as we have these issues with the technical difficulties with the laptop, maybe you start relaxing, right? So you had sort of this alpha waves, which are 8 to 12 hertz slow oscillations, right? And I really hope you're not in this mode, which is associated with deep sleep, right? This is delta waves. So I don't see anybody in this mode, I think, not even at the top. So OK, cool. Oh, somebody waving there. OK. You're not in deep sleep, that's for sure. OK. OK, so and another interesting thing with EEG is besides these waves that are correlated with the kind of state you're in, you can also get potential. You can also get some responses from the brain that are like reflexes. So these are like brain reflexes where you flash something and you get an aha response from the brain. So here's an example of that. So suppose I give you 4 different objects, and maybe you want one object. Maybe you want that medicine bottle. So I can basically flash the borders, those blue borders around those 4 different objects randomly. And every time there's a flash around the medicine bottle, because you're paying attention to it, your brain's going to generate an aha response, right? It's similar to when you're driving around looking for your favorite, your Starbucks, for example, and then you see the sign, maybe you start to get that response in your brain, right? And that's a response called a P300 response. And so you get that also on a computer screen when you're flashing the borders. So here's what that looks like. So if you have these flashes across all, and you look at the average, so each of those squiggly lines is one readout of your brain activity using these scalp electrodes. If you average that out, you'll find that there's one bump. So you can see at the very bottom, there's a little bump there that you can see that comes out of the noise, right? So there's a lot of noise there, but then there's a nice strong bump there. And that's the potential that your brain generates. That's the response, the aha response that the brain generates every time there's a flash on something you're focusing on. So how can we use this particular response, right? So what we did was, so here's again showing you what happens in the brain. So on the right side, you can see a movie where if the flash is on the target that you're focusing on, you get a big red splash, and then you get a blue. So basically, increase in activity at the back of your head where the visual information is being processed. And then again, that propagates forwards towards the front of your brain, where it's further processed, sort of a cognitive processing going on towards the front of the brain. So there's a dramatic difference between when the flash is on an object you're focusing on versus when the flash is on an object you're not interested in or that you're not focusing on. So we use this to essentially build a control system for a humanoid robot, right? So what we did was we had a robot as shown on the left, and the goal was the human was controlling the robot, and it had, the human had to send a command as to where to go and what to pick up on a table, right? So here's a robot going up to a table, sees a red and a green object, and then again you use this flashing mechanism to tell to ask the human what they want, and the human can then say, okay, pick up the red object, and the robot does the rest, right? So it's basically like a robot assistant for you, right? So and typically when I give this talk to a bunch of engineers, they'll say, oh, that's a great way to get beer from my refrigerator, right? You can see where the priorities are. But what we're looking at here is basically like an avatar, right? It's something that could be really helpful for somebody who's completely paralyzed, but they can command this device to go and do things for it, right? For example, do things for the person to go and pick up something from the medicine cabinet or get food and things like that. So again, using just the scalp electrodes, non-invasive, but it could still be used for something very rudimentary and let the robot do all the hard work of figuring out how to walk and pick up things and so on. And also, I mentioned that there's these oscillations. So we talked about this in the case of ECOG, the patients, and recording from the surface of their brain. So can we do the same thing also with scalp electrodes, right? So can we do it also with EEG? And so here's again an example of what the signal looks like. As you start to imagine a movement, so in this case, let's say you're trying to imagine moving your right hand. And then you can also do the same thing when you imagine moving your left hand. And you can start to look at the differences that your brain generates for imagining these different kinds of movements, right? So on the right-hand side, it shows what happens when you start to imagine moving your right hand. You see these oscillations that are slow oscillations that go away, similar to what you had in the ECOG signal from the brain surface signal. So we can now use that. You can detect those reduction in oscillations on a computer, right? And by a computer using, again, machine learning algorithms, right? You can classify that as saying, OK, now the brain is reducing its oscillations, and we can use that to control a device. So here's what we did. So we had a person train over a period of several weeks, learn to control their, the imagery signals. So over time, they were able to use these brain signals to essentially map different kinds of imaginations to different kinds of movement in a virtual world, right? So for example, the most natural mapping would be you imagine moving your feet, and that should enable you to move forward in this world, in this virtual world. You imagine moving your right hand, that should make you turn to the right. And imagine moving your left hand, that should make you turn left in this virtual world. So very natural mapping of movement in a virtual world. And the task of this person was to go around in this virtual, so it's a navigation task again, so going around in this virtual world, but then there's strewn about there these little coins, gold coins that they have to pick up. So very similar to David's task again, but here they're using their brain signals to navigate directly in this virtual environment. And so after several weeks of training, you have people that are able to now avoid obstacles, turn around, move in this virtual environment, purely using their imagined signals, motor signals. And what you'll find here is also a controversy in the field, which is some people are better at this than others. It's just like learning any motor skill. Some people are better at learning tennis or driving, for example, or typing. So again, there's a controversy in the field about are there people who are BCI illiterate, right, which is they're not able to learn to control their brain signals to move, right? And some people say, yes, there is that fundamental limitation. With some people, others say, no, it's because you haven't worked hard enough to really extract their proper brain signal, right? So I'm more in the latter camp, that maybe you have to work harder to really get good signals from these very noisy brain signals. OK, so these are all examples of brain-computer interfaces, and that's shameless advertising for a book that I wrote. It's basically an introduction to the field. And this was several years ago when I was at the point where a lot of people were asking me about, is there a way for me to get introduced to this field? And there wasn't really a textbook that could take people through both neuroscience and the computer science and engineering aspects. So this was an outcome of that effort during my last sabbatical. And as I was thinking about these issues, most of the applications in this case are, assistive applications, right? So helping people who are disabled, trying to find, ways in which you can extract intention to move and then use it to control devices. So this is basically the paradigm that we've been working with so far, right? So you have a brain cap or another way of measuring brain signals, send that to a computer or a robot, and it'll do something with it, right? So an interesting question to ask, I mean, it's almost a philosophical question here, is to ask, what if you can actually send that to another person, right? So, and this sort of gets into this notion of, telepathy, right? So people have been talking about this in science fiction for a long time, but is this something that's even possible, where you have information from one brain, and you're translating it in some way using a computer, and then you're transmitting it to another brain, where that brain makes sense of it, and then does something useful with it, right? And this sort of is going from a medical application now into more of a science fiction type application. But hey, we are professors, we can do that, right? We're researchers in a university, so let's try that, right? So at that time, I was looking for somebody who would be crazy enough to try this, who had the expertise in sending information into the brain, non-invasively, no surgeries involved. And luckily, in the psychology department, we had Andrea Stocco, who is an expert in using transcranial magnetic stimulation, so a magnetic way of stimulating the brain. And people had been using that much more for disturbing the brain, so that they can see what the effect of disturbing the brain is, right? Whereas we said, okay, what if we use it constructively, right? So can we send information into the brain that is being given from a brain-computer interface from another person, right? So we're sort of looking at it in a completely different way, and Andy was really enthusiastic about it, and so we said, let's try it out, right? So, so just to give you an overview of what that means, so this is the transcranial magnetic stimulation that I talked about. So there's these magnetic coils that use electric currents to induce a magnetic field that is then able to penetrate the skull and then cause an electric field inside your brain, right? In a location that's close to the surface of the brain. And that's the way that you could get activity inside your brain without even opening up your skull or any surgery, right? So it's a very standard technology that people have used also for medical purposes, but mainly it's been used for cognitive neuroscience research and so on. And so here's the paradigm that we said, okay, let's do a proof of concept where both of us were the guinea pigs, because we only got permission to do it initially for 2 people, right? So it was me and Andrea. And so we, like true scientists, we said, okay, let's actually do it on ourselves. And so Andrea got the harder part, which is his brain was the one that was getting stimulated, and then I was the one who was sending the commands. And we decided to come up with a simple paradigm, which is, I'm going to imagine moving my hand, and then that information needs to be parsed by the computer, and that information is then sent to his location in the brain that controls his hand, right? So we've mapped out Andrea's motor cortex, and we know exactly which location in his brain controls his hand movement. So every time that I'm imagining moving my hand, it's going to get translated through the computer, through the internet, because he was in a different location on campus, and then it goes to the transcranial magnetic stimulator that's located on the location of his brain in the motor cortex that controls his hand, right? And then in order to show that we can use this in a setting where there's a purpose, right? We used a game, right? So it's a very simple game where there's a city that's being threatened by these pirates, and the pirates can be shooting rockets at the city. But from time to time, you also have a supply plane, the airplane that comes in towards the city. So you want to shoot the pirates' rockets, but you should not shoot the supply airplane that's coming to help the city, right? So there's an interesting accuracy that there's an accuracy you can compute about how accurate are you in imagining moving your hand and then getting that information out to Andrea's hand, right? And so in this case, you can almost say that I can see, I can perceive, but I cannot act, right? So I do not have the keyboard. Andrea had the keyboard, and he could press the key, but he could not see, right? So he could not perceive. He could only get information from my brain, and then he could use that information to then hit the key that would then destroy the missile, right? So some ways he's lending me a hand, right? You can call it that. Bad joke, right? So that was the paradigm, right? So you have one person imagining moving, and then the other person enacting it, right? So and we have to collaborate together. The 2 brains have to collaborate in order to complete that task. And so here's one of the trials where you can see I'm essentially looking at the computer screen, and I'm controlling this cursor that will hit the target. So every time there's a pirate rocket that's coming in towards the city, I'm imagining moving my hand. And that, in turn, sends a signal to Andrea's brain. He's shown on the right-hand side. And he doesn't really know what's happening, right? So he can't even see the screen. He only knows that at some point in time, there's going to be a magnetic stimulation of his brain that causes his hand to twitch. And so you can see his hand twitching there, and that hits the keyboard, and that indicates a successful trial, right? And so this is actually the very first, human brain-to-brain interface demonstration that happened here on campus. I was in the computer science building, and Andy was in the Portage Bay building on campus. And so that got a lot of attention, and then there was obviously a lot of criticisms about, okay, you're only getting like a little twitch of the hand. And so we've done other experiments more recently where we've stimulated the visual cortex, where you can start to see things. Like you can send a message, in terms of a yes or a no. Because when you stimulate the visual system, you start to see little spots of light, and you can use that as a message from one person to another person. And we've shown that you can use that to also communicate and have two-way communication. So one person sends a question, and you can play a 20 questions-like game by having the other person send an answer and go back and forth. So that's another demonstration that we did after this. Finally, just to leave you with other advances in the field, this is, again, an experiment that was done in a lab at Berkeley, where Jack Gallant's lab, where they showed that you can use fMRI images, fMRI signals from a human brain to reconstruct what they're seeing right now. Right? So this is probably as close as you'll get to like brain reading, right? In the sense that you have a very large dictionary of videos that you've shown the person, and you've built a map between what their brain activity looks like using fMRI and what the videos are that they're seeing right now. And then you can, and now you show them some new movies, such as these, and then you can use that mapping, the dictionary of brain activity to the videos to reconstruct what they're seeing. Right? And you can see it's not the best reconstruction, it's not very clear, but it's close enough. It sort of gives you a blurry figure. It shows you maybe it's a human versus some blob moving and so on. So things are getting to the point where you can start to look at what does it really mean in terms of being able to understand brain activity and being able to reconstruct what the brain is actually perceiving right now. And so just to give you a wrap-up of some of the applications, I've already talked a lot about medical applications, and this just gives you a list of applications ranging from prosthetics to restoring sensation all the way down to using it for rehabilitation, where you can accelerate rehabilitation for stroke, for example. There's also been a lot of interest in non-medical applications, and that spans the gamut of education all the way down to brain sourcing and lie detection. So you might ask, what is brain sourcing? So this is an experiment that people have done where they've shown that you can use a bunch of humans that are much better at detecting things in images, and you can essentially take their brain activity and be able to discern is there a particular object you're looking for in the computer screen or not, and you do much better than using a computer vision algorithm or an image processing algorithm. So you're essentially using brains as a way to process information, right? And similarly, you can imagine how you can use this for lie detection, right? So people right now use galvanic skin response, which is notoriously unreliable, but then there's claims being made right now that you could do much better than using a galvanic skin response test by using directly brain signals, right? Obviously a very controversial topic. Similarly, neuromarketing is the other big one, right? A lot of people are interested in how do you actually harness brain signals for giving you the best advertisements, or or even fine-tuning like the next Super Bowl ad so that it appeals to the most number of people, right? Lots of companies out there. So speaking of companies, Facebook has got into the act very recently. They've formed a BCI, Brain-Computer Interface Group. They're hiring right now. A company called Kernel, founded by the CEO of a company called Braintree that got sold to PayPal. His goal is to, again, build sort of the next generation of brain-computer interfaces that can augment humans. Right? So not necessarily medical, but also beyond medical to augmentation of humans. And most recently, just 2 days ago, Elon Musk announced that he has a new company now called Neuralink. And so even Elon Musk is now interested in this particular area. And again, his idea is, AI is threatening the world. AI, artificial intelligence, is a threat to humanity. So how best to beat artificial intelligence than to join with them, right? So basically, humans are going to join with AI and become, I guess, an augmented human. So I heard that. So that's exactly where we get to. So if you say, where exactly is this going, right? A very important aspect here is to look at the ethical issues, right? So the most basic ones, of course, are health and safety issues. So things like, for medical patients, are we going to we have to look at the risks versus benefits, invasive versus non-invasive, and so on. But there's also interesting legal issues that come up. Once you start using these kinds of devices, there's a lot of potential for abuse and so on, right? So there's a lot of issues about liability. So if you're controlling a prosthetic hand, which has some robotics built into it, who's liable for damage that's being caused? Is it your brain, or is it the robotics manufacturer? I mean, there's really some really interesting issues that come up that I think lawyers will have a field day trying to figure that out. And then also more importantly, I think for us, as we start to look at all these issues with cybersecurity and hacking, things like that, right? So can you imagine what would happen if you start to have hackers actually hacking into actual brain interfaces? I mean, that's just completely unthinkable, right? The fact that they might be hacking into these devices that are then violating privacy. There's also issues about, so just put up some words like, instead of wiretapping, if you're worried about wiretapping, think about brain tapping, right? Similarly, the word brainwash has been used a lot in colloquial English, but I mean, now you can literally do brainwashing, right, eventually. I mean, these are things that I think one needs to talk about right now, as opposed to wait until the technology gets to the point where it's too late to start talking about them. And that's one of the reasons why when I wrote the book, I had a whole chapter devoted to neuroethics, to basically say, okay, we need to start talking about these issues right now. And finally, also just the societal implications, right? So as you have augmentation as one of the application areas of these technologies, that's going to leave a whole bunch of very important issues about those who have the capacity, the wealth to actually buy these devices, to give it to their children or to themselves. And then what about people who don't have access to that? So how do we actually regulate that? And there's a lot of interesting issues that come up that I think policymakers in DC, if they can sort of get out of the current mode of operation, they have to think about these issues, right? Of how do we actually regulate these kinds of things? Are there ways to make it equitable? And there's some social justice issues there also that one needs to think about. So we have a very strong and I would say a very unique neuroethics team at the center. So at CSNE, our center, we have a group of philosophers who are working with neurosurgeons and engineers and having their students embedded in these labs that are working on these devices to really talk about these issues and ask questions about what happens to a patient's identity when they have a device that's implanted in their brain. How does it change? How does it affect their family members? What are the implications of augmentation? Do user surveys with people, both patients as well as people who might be interested in these devices beyond medical applications. So there's a lot of interesting work being done. I think we're at the leading edge of the field in terms of neuroethics at the University of Washington. Okay, so here's the final exam, right? So I've given you a whole bunch of examples. So let's see if you can figure out, okay, I talked a little bit about this Dr. Octopus example from Hollywood. So how do we match with Hollywood in terms of really being able to do the kinds of things that Hollywood has shown us, right? So what about being able to control a robotic arm, right? Yes? Thumbs up? Yes. Okay, yeah. So you're right. So we had this example where a patient in this case was able to control a robotic arm, and I guess the next step would be, if somebody is willing to have these electrodes implanted in their brains, potentially they could have a third arm, right? That's augmenting their two arms. So maybe potentially possible. What about controlling or firing a missile from an airplane using just your thoughts, right? So it's just an on or off kind of thing. Yep, fire or not fire. Yeah, maybe, right? So yeah, we sort of had this example where you could use your thoughts to essentially guide yourself in a maze. And that was done after a lot of training, and some people are better at it than others, but you might have the capacity to do that if you practice a lot, and then you're able to generate the right kind of signals. What about this avatar kind of situation where a paralyzed person is able to control another body or another robot? Yeah? Sort of, right? I mean, we had two examples of that. One was a robotic avatar. The other one was Andrea, right? I mean, he was kind of like my avatar for just a hand movement, right? So in some sense, it's very, very primitive. But at least as a proof of concept, seems like the technology is getting there where you can start to do these very simple, primitive kind of things. And finally, what about this? So this is from, anybody know what movie this is? Yeah, this is from The Matrix, right? So can we actually, do things like learn Kung Fu in just a matter of seconds, downloading it? Can we actually slow down time and just dodge bullets and then start to fly and things like that? I mean, is that, yes. Well, maybe, yeah. Maybe we are living in a matrix, right? So maybe we are doing it already, right? Who knows? Yeah. So anyway, I'll leave you with that. And again, thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much. So we would have, I know we're running a little bit late, but if there was a question or two, this is what. Can you repeat the question? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the question is, are there these kinds of devices that could be used for Alzheimer's patients? And so there has been an effort that was funded by the DoD that was looking at memory implants. And so essentially, being able to have these implants that can work with the hippocampus, a structure that David talked about, but can we actually have a prosthesis, like a memory prosthesis, right? That you could sort of have a replacement for some of the lost memories or store new memories in this artificial device as opposed to having it in a natural hippocampal network, right? So there's already been some work done on that. There's some progress being made. But I think there's still some ways to go, right? We're still in the process of understanding how the brain stores memories and so on. And so I think it's an area that a lot of people are interested in, that I think we are making some progress, but it'll take some time.
That's a good question. Yeah, one last question.
Could this technology be used possibly for removing childhood trauma, perchance, rather than sitting and talking to someone?
For removing trauma.
Oh, you mean an application such as PTSD?
To remove painful childhood memories.
Yes, yes. So potentially, yeah. So one of the other funded projects by the DoD was to try to use these kinds of bidirectional brain-computer interfaces to help people who have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so in that case, it would involve potentially, finding ways in which you can wean them away from some bad memories or experiences that they might have had. Again, in a very early stage, but ultimately what that relies on is very similar to what I talked about for stroke rehabilitation, which is rewiring a part of the brain so that you don't have those kinds of memories that you might find very traumatic. But of course, I mean, it also involves a lot of neuroscience research that needs to be done in terms of, first of all, locate those memories and then try to find ways in which you can wean away from those memories, right? So again, I think very early stages, but there's a potential there to use these types of devices.
Thank you.